All right, so let's move on to Roman numeral 2, foreign policy, which was a big part of Kennedy's presidency. He had a lot of stuff that was done in the first years of him being president, and obviously his presidency was cut short. But again, this was something that was very important to our country dealing with the Cold War. We talked about the U-2 spy plane, how that had heightened tensions, and something else had heightened tensions, and it was dealing with Cuba. It's interesting now because you guys are kind of growing up in a time period where Cuba isn't as major of a story as it was back in the 50s and the 60s. Um, if you don't know where Cuba's at, it's located just about 90 miles south of Florida. Americans can actually vacation to Cuba. Maybe not right now during the pandemic, but you are able to go on vacation there. And it had been the first time that Americans have been able to do that in a long, long time. But you see, it's really not too far from the coast of Florida, about 90 miles. They actually have uh, hundreds and hundreds of stories, maybe even thousands of people that have, during this time period, had escaped from Cuba to sail up to Florida. How did they sail? They took rafts. They made rafts. They came up with some type of boating device and got themselves up to Florida to claim exile and get out of Cuba. And it was a big deal. And the main reason a lot of these people were fleeing was there was a new dictator. His name was Fidel Castro. You guys have probably heard of him before. He was communistic, and as a result, he quickly becomes friends with Russia. There's a picture of him on your bottom left-hand side. And he was a pretty brutal dictator to the people in Cuba. Now, us being involved in Cuba isn't too crazily new. If you guys think back to us talking about Cuba beforehand, we've talked about them when we talked about in right around the late 1800s, early 1900s, and dealing with that with the Spanish-American War. But by about 1957 or 58, I think, is when he took over. He was communistic, and as a result of him being communistic, this is really the first country that's in our hemisphere that had turned communistic. And remember, our policy towards communism is containment based on George Kennan's policy. And so once we have a country that is closer to, closer to us, it's communistic. It kind of gets kind of get a little bit nervous. Now, we weren't necessarily too worried that the Cubans were going to invade us, mainly because they were a smaller country and their military wasn't unbelievable, although Fidel Castro was going to try to build that up. But what we became nervous about was how quickly he became friends with Russia. And basically, a friend of Russia is an enemy of ours. And Cuba becomes a pretty good ally with the Russians. And Russia kind of sees this as an opportunity to scare us more. We talked last week about um, the scare tactics that different people used with the missiles and hydrogen bombs and that type of thing. But he quickly became friends with us, or with Russia, and that makes him an enemy of us. As Castro quickly removed any American businesses from Cuba. America had a large influence. As I said, we've been involved in there since the late 1800s with the Platt Amendment and Teller Amendment. You guys might remember those ones. But he quickly kicked out all of these American businesses that were making a lot of money. Now, the reason he kicked them out was because they were making money and they were sending it back to America, and they weren't necessarily investing in Cuba, and that drove him crazy. He didn't like that plan. He didn't like the fact that the Americans were doing that to them and to their economy. And so he kicked them out. And he decided to give some of these businesses back over to Cuba. The problem was is he decided on what business was best for him, and also what business would potentially be best for the Russians. So Castro quickly removed these American businesses from Cuba, and that, wasn't too surprising, but it was enough to kind of make us a little bit aware because of how he kicked the Americans out. As time goes on, Kennedy wanted the American people to know he took the Cold War seriously, especially when he takes over as president. One of the things that some people thought that maybe Harry Truman and even Eisenhower was a little bit soft on communism. So Kennedy wanted to make sure that the American people knew that this was a big deal to him. He wanted to take the Cold War seriously. And the idea behind communism spreading was we didn't want it, we wanted containment. And so we talked about that before, and that was our American policy towards communism expanding. We didn't want it to happen. And at this point in time, communism had expanded over towards us 90 miles south of Florida. And so Kennedy kind of had almost felt like he had to do something, like show America, like, hey, we're not pleased with, this happening, and the Russians getting all of these, supplies over to the Cubans, and the Cubans being able to have Russian stuff over there. They're a lot closer than an ocean away now. Now it's just 90 miles, and in the 1960s, 90 miles wasn't really that big of a deal. So, Kennedy and his advisors decided to take extreme measures to stop Fidel Castro. Now, some of his advisors actually gave him some pretty bad advice here, because what they start talking about is maybe we should try to kill this guy. And so the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been kind of around since about the 1940s, they had decided that they were going to come up with these different various missions to try to kill Fidel Castro. There was even one mission that they talked about trying to do it when he was like swimming, in the ocean type stuff. It was just some weird, crazy, crazy things. They even had one that they were going to try to replace his cigars, that where his hair would all fall out. I don't know if that's actually true. I need to look that one up again. I heard that a really long time ago, but it was just kind of one of those things where in that culture, a beard and a mustache are a pretty big deal. And so we tried these different various methods of trying to make him look bad, and then eventually maybe he would lose power. But it got to the point where his advisors and Kennedy kind of sat down and said, maybe we actually need to sit down, figure out a plan on how we can get him out of office. And when they mean get him out of office, they probably mean kill him here. And so they start talking about how they're going to do this. And what that does is that leads us to the next part of how this is going to go down, and that is letter B, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, you guys are like, the Bay of Pigs, that sounds crazy. Well, the Bay of Pigs is actually literally a bay called, I don't know what the Spanish word for pigs is, so you guys are going to have to help me here. I took Spanish forever ago, and I had a really, really, really bad teacher. I know what baño is, and I'm pretty sure I know what queso is, but in carne asada, but those are mainly because I see them at restaurants. And tortilla, I think that's a chip or something like that. Anyway, so, but you have this area called the Bay of Pigs. Now, again, if you're picturing Florida, Florida Keys are kind of over here. And this is literally a bay where pigs actually used to feed, and where they would hang out, and where they would actually, like, I don't know if pigs graze, but that's kind of where it was. And so that's why it's called the Bay of Pigs. But anyway, when Castro took over Cuba, many Cubans actually fled in fear because of how he was treating anybody that was friendly to the Americans, meaning he would take care of them, put them in prison, and oftentimes end up killing them. And so a lot of them fled up to America, and that kind of prompted the idea by Kennedy and his advisors that potentially what we could do is train people to go back, the people that hated him so badly, train them in America to go back and possibly take him out of office. And we really thought that we could do that we could train these individuals, and they would be motivated to come back and get their hometowns and get their country back and invade and kill Fidel Castro. Now, there were several people that were really against this idea, but enough people had convinced Kennedy that this would be a good plan that he decided that he's going to try to go forward with this. Now, what potential problems do you see here? Well, it's not the American military isn't going to be the problem. We have a superior military towards Cuba. The problem is who are the Cubans friends with? The Cubans are friends with the Russians, and if we invade them, there's the potential that Russia could get involved, and that's what we were worried about. And we also didn't really want to help. We wanted to help the Cubans, the revolutionaries, go back and kill Castro, but we didn't want our troops to be invading any areas potentially. They wanted to just let the Cubans do it, so it would kind of look like them, like a revolution. And so that was their thought. That was their idea. We would lend them guns. We'd actually even give them transportation. They got some of our boats, and they would, be able to paint it in Florida. They'd paint it whatever colors they wanted and put like skull and crossbones on it or whatever, and they would be able to do that. And we told them, hey guys, we would support you, and if it really came down to it, if we absolutely had to, yeah, we would go ahead and give you air support and that type of thing. But deep down inside, we weren't really too convinced that that was going to be the best thing, because we kind of wanted to avoid World War III. The problem was the mission failed badly. it was not a success. The people were not really well trained, and although we thought that they weren't really well trained, and many of them got captured. I believe it was like 1,300 men that tried to invade Cuba, and this is a picture of their boats. You can see some of their guns here, semi-automatic weapons and fully automatic weapons, but this is kind of what they did. But going back to this picture here, the mission just failed absolutely badly. We didn't really support them the way that we said we were. And within a few hours, this invasion was completely turned down. And Castro captured these individuals, put them in jail, killed several of them, captured their families, all sorts of stuff. It was a bad situation. And the Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster for President Kennedy politically. These individuals that got captured, you notice they're in fatigues. A lot of them are in fatigues as they were military men trying to do this. But these are Castro's men that are capturing them, and they're going to put them in prison, and some of them will end up dying. Kennedy's popularity declined with this failed invasion because you think about this, everybody kind of sees this on the news. All of a sudden, it's like, well, the Americans were supposed to help us, and we really look bad because we didn't help them, and we really look bad like we could have helped them and probably destroyed and taken out Castro. But then it also looks like we're messing with other countries trying to kill their leaders, and we would never stand for that happening to us. So why would we do it to other people? The answer becomes containment. That was our policy. And so this becomes a pretty big problem, and it creates more tensions between the U.S. and the communist countries at this point in time, because now they're saying, okay, beforehand you guys were just giving money to make sure people didn't turn communistic. Now you're actually going after our leaders and killing our leaders. And as I said before, Cuba and Russia were friends, and that's going to create more problems. And what that's going to do is that is going to lead us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this is a longer discussion, so not as many notes today, but a lot more content perhaps. So we're going to stop there, and tomorrow we will spend time on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a pretty cool story. And I got a video clip that I'll show you during that time as well. Have a good day.